I was setting up my new security system when every speaker in my garage exploded with the most ear-splitting noise I'd ever heard. Static so loud, it felt like needles in my brain. That's when I saw her through the window, Karen standing in my driveway with some kind of device in her hands, pointing it right at my house. 911? Yes, my neighbor is using illegal radio transmitters. She was screaming into her phone. He's interfering with emergency services. Send someone now. The sound of my old fire department badge hitting the concrete still echoes in my head. It had fallen off the shelf when the whole place started vibrating from whatever electronic warfare she was waging against me. That badge belonged to my father. 30 years as a volunteer fireman, 20 as their radio operator. The irony wasn't lost on me. If you're watching Conflict Story, you know it's never just about radio waves. Let me back up. 3 days earlier, I'd finally decided to install a proper security system. Living alone since Martha passed, the house felt too quiet, too vulnerable. The system came with radio communication between sensors, all perfectly legal, all properly licensed. I've been a ham radio operator for 20 years, just like Dad. Everything by the book. But Karen, she'd been watching me set it up from her kitchen window like some kind of surveillance hawk. The first sign of trouble came when I tested the system. I was adjusting the frequency on my handheld radio when Karen's front door slammed open. She marched across our adjoining driveways in her perfectly pressed yoga pants and that blonde bob that never moved in the wind. "What is that noise?" she demanded. "Radio check. All legal frequencies," I said, showing her my amateur license. "FCC approved." She snatched the license from my hands, studied it like she was some kind of federal inspector. "This doesn't give you the right to blast electronic pollution into my home." Electronic pollution, that was a new one. "Ma'am, this is lower power than your garage door opener." "Don't ma'am me. I work in IT. I know electromagnetic interference when I hear it." She thrust my license back at me. "Fix it, or I'll fix it for you." That should have been my warning. Should have realized Karen wasn't just another complaining neighbor. This woman had a plan. But I went ahead and finished the installation anyway. Everything tested perfect. Motion sensors talking to the main panel, radio links crystal clear. For 2 days, I actually felt secure again. Foolish maybe, but secure. Then came that morning with the electronic attack. Within minutes of Karen's 911 call, I could hear the sirens. Not one car, 3. The FCC van was the one that made my stomach drop. Federal Communications Commission doesn't just show up for neighbor complaints. They show up when someone's reported serious interference with emergency services. Agent Wilson stepped out of that van like he was raiding a drug lab. Clipboard, detection equipment, the works. Behind him came 2 sheriff's deputies. "Sir, we need to talk," Wilson said. "You're David Morrison?" "That's right." "We've received reports of unauthorized high-frequency transmission causing interference with emergency services. Federal offense, Mr. Morrison. We have a warrant to inspect your equipment." I handed over my licenses, explained the security system, showed them everything was properly registered. Wilson seemed reasonable at first. He tested my equipment with his meters, checked the frequencies, reviewed my paperwork. "Everything appears legal," he told his partner. Then he looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. "Problem is, sir, the interference is still happening, right now." That's when I heard it again, that brutal static screaming from every speaker in my house. But this time, I was standing right next to Wilson's detection equipment. The meter was going crazy, and the needle was pointing toward Karen's house, not mine. "Sir, that signal's not coming from your equipment," Wilson said quietly. Karen appeared at her front door like she'd been waiting for her cue. "Officers, thank God you're here. He's been broadcasting that noise all morning. It's interfering with my computer, my phone, everything." I watched Wilson walk toward Karen's house with his detection equipment. The closer he got to her property line, the stronger the signal became. But Karen kept talking, kept pointing at me, kept building her case. "I have documentation," she said, pulling out her phone. "Timestamps, photos, even recordings of the interference. This has been going on for days." Have you ever watched someone lie so confidently that you almost believe them yourself? Wilson was getting readings off the charts now, standing in Karen's driveway, but Karen had an answer for that too. "He's probably using some kind of directional antenna, bouncing the signal off my house to cover his tracks." That's when I realized Karen wasn't just tech savvy. She was smart, dangerously smart, and she'd done her homework. "Mr. Morrison," Wilson said, walking back toward me, "I'm going to need to confiscate your equipment pending investigation. Federal Regulation 97.01. We can seize any equipment suspected of interference." I watched them load $15,000 worth of radio gear into their van, my father's old emergency radio, the new security system, everything. Karen stood on her porch the whole time, arms crossed, smiling like she'd won the lottery. "Just keeping the neighborhood safe," she called out as Wilson handed me the seizure receipt. But here's what Karen didn't know, what she couldn't have known. That old fire department badge lying on my garage floor, it wasn't just a keepsake, it was still active. Dad had made sure of that before he died, and it gave me access to something Karen's IT background hadn't prepared her for. The Emergency Services Radio Network, where all interference gets logged automatically, where every transmission, every frequency, every source gets recorded and time-stamped. That night, I made a phone call to the county emergency coordinator, old friend of Dad's. "Tom, it's David Morrison's son. I think we've got a problem with someone jamming emergency frequencies." What I discovered next changed everything. The emergency services logs told a story Karen never expected anyone to read. Tom pulled up 3 days of interference reports on his computer screen. Every spike, every disruption, every moment when paramedics couldn't reach dispatch. It was all there, time-stamped and GPS located. "Look at this pattern," Tom said, pointing at the data. "Interference starts at 6:47 a.m., stops at 6:52 a.m., starts again at 11:15 a.m., stops at 11:23 a.m., like someone's turning a switch on and off." The smell of stale coffee filled the emergency dispatch center as we scrolled through the reports. Each interference burst was pinpointed to a 40-meter radius around Karen's house. Not mine, hers. "She's been jamming us for a week," Tom continued. 3 ambulance calls delayed because paramedics couldn't reach dispatch. 1 house fire, where we lost radio contact with the first responders. Have you ever felt your blood turn cold in your veins? Tom, people could have died. People almost did die, David. Mrs. Henderson on Maple Street had a heart attack Tuesday morning. Paramedics lost radio contact for 8 minutes because of this interference. I stared at the screen, watching the digital evidence pile up. Karen hadn't just attacked me. She'd attacked the entire emergency response system for our county. "There's more," Tom said. "The interference signature matches industrial-grade jamming equipment, military surplus stuff, not something you pick up at Radio Shack." Back home, I sat in my garage staring at the empty shelves where my radio equipment used to be. The silence felt wrong. For 20 years, this place had hummed with the quiet chatter of emergency services, weather reports, distant conversations bouncing off the atmosphere. Now it was dead air. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before, a tiny reflection in my garage window, just a glint of metal from Karen's attic window, something that looked suspiciously like an antenna. I grabbed my binoculars, the old pair Dad used for spotting fires from the lookout tower. Through Karen's attic window, I could see it clearly now, a professional jamming array, the kind used by military electronic warfare units. Multiple antennas, control boxes, everything needed to turn someone's house into a radio dead zone. She hadn't just planned this attack, she'd invested serious money in it. The next morning, Karen was waiting for me at my mailbox. Same yoga pants, same predatory smile. "How's the peace and quiet, David?" she asked. "Amazing what happens when people follow the rules." "The rules?" I said. "Which rules are those, Karen?" "FCC regulations, no unauthorized transmissions, no interference with neighbors' electronic equipment." She held up her phone. "I've got the whole code memorized now. Fascinating reading." I wanted to tell her about the emergency services logs, about Mrs. Henderson's heart attack, about the house fire where firefighters lost communication. But something held me back. Call it instinct. Call it Dad's voice in the back of my head, telling me to gather intelligence before launching an attack. "You seem to know a lot about radio interference," I said instead. Karen's smile got wider. "You'd be surprised what you can learn on the internet, especially about illegal broadcasting and how to stop it." That afternoon, I drove to the electronic supply store where I had bought my original equipment. The owner, Mike, had been selling radio gear for 30 years. He knew every trick in the book. "Someone's using a jammer against you?" Mike asked. That's serious federal crime territory, David. $10,000 fine, possible prison time. How would someone even get equipment like that? Mike led me to the back of his store, past the shelves of legal amateur radio equipment. Military surplus. There's a whole black market for electronic warfare gear. Stuff that's supposed to go back to the Pentagon ends up in private hands. He pulled up a website on his computer. Look at this. Industrial jamming array. Covers everything from 30 to 3,000 megahertz. Perfect for RF security applications, they claim. $25,000. $25,000. Karen had spent more on destroying my hobby than I'd spent building it over 2 decades. Here's the thing, though, Mike continued. Equipment like this leaves fingerprints, specific interference patterns, frequency signatures. If someone's using military-grade jammers, the FCC can track it down. What if they already confiscated the wrong equipment? Mike leaned back in his chair. Then you've got bigger problems, because whoever's running the real jamming operation knows they're safe, at least until someone proves the FCC grabbed the wrong gear. That night, I called Tom again. I need a favor. Can you run another interference scan? Target Karen's house specifically. David, I can't just point surveillance equipment at random citizens. Tom, she's jamming emergency services. Mrs. Henderson almost died because Karen wanted to play electronic warfare with her neighbor. Long pause, then, give me an hour. While I waited, I found myself staring at Dad's old fire department badge, still lying on the garage floor where it had fallen during Karen's first electronic attack. I picked it up, felt the weight of it. 30 years of emergency calls, 30 years of being the voice that connected people in crisis to the help they needed. Karen had threatened all of that, not just my hobby, not just my security system. She'd threatened the invisible network that keeps communities safe. My phone buzzed. Tom. David, you were right. Active jamming signature, broadcasting from 847 Pine Street. That's Karen's address. Industrial-grade equipment, probably military surplus. Can you document it, officially? Already done. I've got 3 hours of continuous monitoring data. Timestamps, frequency analysis, power measurements, more than enough to reopen the FCC investigation. I felt something I hadn't experienced since Martha's funeral, the moment when grief transforms into purpose. Tom, I need you to do one more thing. Don't file that report yet. What, David? This is federal evidence. Just give me 24 hours. Karen thinks she's won. Let her keep thinking that. But tomorrow night, I want to show her what happens when you threaten emergency services. After I hung up, I sat in my silent garage and planned Karen's downfall. She'd used her technical knowledge against me. Now it was time to use mine against her. But first, I needed to make a trip to the airport. Dave Martinez had been my neighbor for 12 years before I learned he was an aviation electronics technician at Regional Airport. Funny how you can live next to someone and never really know what they do for a living until you need their expertise. I found him in his garage that evening, elbow deep in the guts of some kind of radio equipment. The sharp smell of flux and heated metal told me he was soldering circuit boards. Dave, got a minute? He looked up, safety glasses perched on his forehead. Hey, David, heard about your radio trouble. FCC really took all your gear? Every last piece, but that's not why I'm here. I pulled out my phone, showed him the photos I'd taken of Karen's attic window. Recognize this equipment? Dave squinted at the screen, zoomed in on the antenna array. His expression changed from curious to concerned to downright angry. Where did you take this? My neighbor's house, the one who called the FCC on me. Jesus Christ, David, that's a military jammer, an ALQ 99 series, if I'm reading it right. We use similar equipment at the airport for testing electronic warfare countermeasures. Testing what? Dave set down his soldering iron, gave me his full attention. When military aircraft come in for maintenance, we have to test their jamming resistance, make sure their communication systems can push through enemy electronic warfare. The pieces started clicking together in my head. What would happen if someone pointed that equipment at civilian frequencies? Complete communication blackout. Emergency services, air traffic control, everything would go dark. Dave's face had gone pale. David, if someone's running military jamming equipment in a residential area, they've been interfering with county emergency services for a week. Ambulances can't reach dispatch. Fire department loses radio contact. That's not just illegal. That's attempted murder. Dave was already reaching for his phone. I need to call airport security. If that jammer is affecting our air traffic frequencies... Wait. I put my hand on his arm. Before you make that call, I need to ask you something. How would someone prove that jammer is active? Prove it beyond any doubt? Dave thought for a moment. Real-time spectrum analysis. Record the jamming signature while it's broadcasting, triangulate the source, document everything with GPS coordinates and timestamps. Could you do that? Me personally, no. But the airport has mobile monitoring equipment. We use it to track down interference sources that threaten aircraft communications. He paused. Why are you asking? Because the person running that jammer thinks they're untouchable. They reported me to the FCC, watched them confiscate my equipment, and now they believe they've won. Dave studied my face. You want to catch them in the act. I want to bury them. The next morning, Karen was in her front yard when I left for work. She was trimming roses that didn't need trimming, positioning herself for maximum visibility. The performance was almost theatrical. "Morning, David," she called out cheerfully. "How are you enjoying the silence?" I stopped at my truck door. Silence? No more radio chatter, no more electronic noise pollution, peace and quiet, just like a neighborhood should be. You seem pretty confident that silence is permanent. Karen's smile sharpened. The FCC doesn't make mistakes, David. When they confiscate illegal equipment, it stays confiscated. What if they confiscated the wrong equipment? For just a moment, Karen's mask slipped. I saw something flicker behind her eyes. Not fear exactly, but calculation, like she was running through contingency plans. That would be impossible, she said. I documented everything. Timestamps, interference measurements, even audio recordings of the disruption. Documented from where? From my house, obviously. I'm the victim here. I nodded slowly. Right, the victim. That afternoon, Dave called me at work. I talked to my supervisor. Airport security is very interested in your neighbor's jamming operation. Turns out we've been getting interference reports all week. Pilots losing radio contact on approach, air traffic control dealing with communication blackouts. How interested? Federal Aviation Administration interested. FBI interested. They're treating this as a potential terrorist threat to aviation safety. My hands were shaking as I gripped the phone. Karen hadn't just attacked me, or even the county emergency services. She'd threatened every aircraft using regional airport. Dave, I need you to document that jammer in action, tonight, if possible. Already planned, we've got a mobile monitoring unit standing by. Soon as that jammer starts broadcasting, we'll have GPS coordinates, frequency analysis, power measurements, everything needed to nail whoever's running it. What if she doesn't turn it on? Oh, she will. Airport security is sending an aircraft over your neighborhood at 8 p.m. Standard communication test. If that jammer is set to auto-respond to aircraft frequencies, she won't be able to stop herself from broadcasting. That evening, I sat on my front porch and waited. At exactly 8 o'clock, I heard the drone of a small aircraft passing overhead. Some kind of airport maintenance flight, flying low enough to trigger any electronic warfare systems in the area. Karen's house stayed dark and quiet for about 30 seconds. Then every dog in the neighborhood started barking. The jamming signature was invisible to human senses, but sensitive animals could feel it, that electromagnetic pulse that military equipment broadcasts when it detects aircraft communications. My neighbor's German Shepherd was howling like someone was torturing him. I couldn't see the mobile monitoring unit, but I knew they were out there somewhere, recording everything. GPS coordinates, signal strength, frequency analysis, digital fingerprints that would trace back to Karen's attic with mathematical certainty. Oh, my phone buzzed. Dave. Got her. Military-grade electronic warfare system, broadcasting from 847 Pine Street. Signal strength indicates industrial equipment, probably military surplus. FBI wants to know if you can keep her from destroying evidence. How long before they move on her? If federal warrant takes time, maybe 48 hours. She'll ditch the equipment if she suspects anything. Then you better make sure she doesn't suspect anything. I hung up and looked across the street at Karen's house. She was standing at her living room window, watching me. Even from 50 yards away, I could see her satisfaction. She thought she'd won completely. Tomorrow, I'd let her keep thinking that. But the day after that, Karen was going to learn what happens when you threaten aircraft communications in post 9/11 America. What would you do if you knew someone's electronic warfare was putting lives at risk? The next morning brought the kind of false peace that makes your skin crawl. Karen was watering her perfect lawn when I stepped outside, humming some tune I didn't recognize. She looked up and waved like we were old friends instead of electronic warfare adversaries. "Beautiful day, isn't it, David?" she called out. "So quiet and peaceful." "Peaceful," I agreed, walking toward my truck. "For now." Something in my tone made her pause. The garden hose kept running, but her attention was laser-focused on my face. "You sound like you're expecting trouble." "Not expecting it, Karen. Just wondering how long this quiet spell will last." She turned off the water with a sharp twist. "What's that supposed to mean?" I shrugged, opened my truck door. Radio interference has a funny way of coming back, like a bad rash. Karen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The FCC confiscated your equipment, David. Problem solved." "Right, my equipment." I climbed into the truck, rolled down the window. Funny thing about electronic interference, though, it leaves traces, digital fingerprints, even after the obvious sources are eliminated. I drove away before she could respond, but I caught her expression in my rearview mirror. For the first time since this whole mess started, Karen looked uncertain. That afternoon, Dave called with an update that changed everything. "David, we've got a problem. Big problem." The urgency in his voice made my stomach drop. "What kind of problem?" "Karen's not working alone. Airport security ran a deeper analysis on that jamming signature. The equipment in her attic is sophisticated, but it's being coordinated with at least 2 other locations. This is organized." "Organized how?" "Professional electronic warfare? Multiple jammers working in sync to create communication dead zones. The kind of operation that takes months of planning and military-level expertise." I pulled over to the side of the road, tried to process what Dave was telling me. "You're saying Karen has partners?" "Either partners or she's working for someone. David, the FBI is treating this as potential domestic terrorism now. They're not waiting 48 hours for a warrant. They're moving tonight." That evening, I positioned myself in my garage with a clear view of Karen's house. If federal agents were about to raid my neighbor, I wanted to see it happen. At exactly 9:15 p.m., Karen's porch light flickered off and on 3 times, some kind of signal. Then I saw them, dark figures moving through the yards 2 streets over. Not FBI agents, too stealthy, too coordinated. These were people who knew how to avoid detection. My phone vibrated with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop interfering or your house burns down tonight." Have you ever felt the moment when a neighborhood dispute becomes a life or death situation? I called Dave immediately. "Something's wrong. Karen just signaled someone, and I'm getting death threats." "David, get out of there, now. FBI is 15 minutes out, but if Karen's people are already moving, I'm not running from my own house." This isn't about pride anymore. These people have military equipment, and they're threatening to kill you. I hung up and did something that would have made my father proud. I activated the emergency radio beacon he'd hidden in the garage 20 years ago. Dad had installed it during his last year as a fire department radio operator, old-school emergency transmitter, hardwired to a battery backup, designed to cut through any interference and reach emergency services even during disasters. The beacon sent out a continuous distress signal with my GPS coordinates. Every emergency responder in the county would know exactly where I was and that I needed help. Then I grabbed Dad's old aluminum baseball bat and waited. The first sign of trouble was my neighbor's German Shepherd going crazy again. That electromagnetic pulse from Karen's jammer, trying to block my emergency beacon. But Dad's transmitter was designed by someone who understood electronic warfare. It cycled through frequencies, hopped around the spectrum, used every trick in the book to maintain communication. Karen's jammer couldn't keep up. At 9:30 p.m., I heard vehicles approaching, multiple engines moving slowly with lights off. Not FBI vehicles. These sounded older, heavier, like military surplus trucks. I moved to my kitchen window for a better view. 3 dark vehicles parked across the street. Men in tactical gear climbed out, all carrying electronic equipment. Not weapons, equipment. They were setting up additional jammers. That's when I understood Karen's real plan. She hadn't just bought one military jammer. She'd organized a cell of people with multiple jammers, enough to create a communication dead zone across the entire county. Whatever they were planning, they needed complete radio silence to pull it off. My emergency beacon was the only thing standing in their way. I watched them approach my house with professional precision. These weren't angry neighbors or local troublemakers. These were people with military training and electronic warfare expertise. Karen's front door opened, and she stepped onto her porch. In the darkness, I could see her pointing directly at my garage. "The beacon is in there," she said clearly. "Hardwired system, probably battery backup. You'll need to physically destroy it." She knew about Dad's emergency transmitter, had probably known about it for months, planning for this moment. One of the tactical team members approached my garage door with what looked like a small explosive device. That's when the FBI arrived. Not sirens or flashing lights, just sudden, overwhelming presence. Vehicles appearing from every direction, agents emerging from shadows I didn't know existed. "Federal agents, nobody move." The tactical team tried to scatter, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. These weren't street criminals running from police. These were professionals who found themselves trapped by better professionals. Karen tried to slip back into her house, but an FBI agent was already waiting at her front door. "Karen Mitchell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to interfere with emergency communications, conspiracy to threaten aviation safety, and domestic terrorism." I watched through my window as they zip-tied her hands behind her back. Even in defeat, Karen looked more angry than scared. "This was about my neighbor's radio interference," she protested. "I was just trying to stop illegal broadcasting." The FBI agent shook his head. "Ma'am, we've been tracking your organization for 6 months. This neighborhood was just your testing ground." Testing ground? Karen hadn't targeted me because of my radio hobby. She'd targeted me because I lived in the perfect location to test military-grade electronic warfare equipment. My phone rang. "Dave." "David, you okay? We're seeing massive jamming activity, and then everything went quiet." "It's over," I said, watching Karen get loaded into an FBI vehicle. "But it was never really about me." "What do you mean?" I looked at Dad's emergency beacon, still transmitting its steady distress signal. Karen was using our neighborhood to test equipment for something bigger, something that required communication dead zones. The truth was scarier than I'd imagined. Karen and her team hadn't just threatened my quiet retirement. They'd been preparing for something that would have threatened everyone. But that night, they learned what happens when you mess with a man whose father taught him to never give up the radio watch. 3 days after Karen's arrest, Agent Sarah Collins knocked on my door with questions that made my blood run cold. "Mr. Morrison, we need to talk about what your neighbor was really planning." Agent Collins looked like she hadn't slept since the raid. Dark circles under her eyes, coffee stains on her FBI windbreaker, the kind of exhaustion that comes from working a case that keeps getting bigger. She spread photographs across my kitchen table, aerial shots of the county, with red circles marking locations I didn't recognize. "These are the other jamming sites we discovered, 12 locations total, all within a 50-mile radius of regional airport." 12? The number hit me like a physical blow. Karen had 11 partners. Karen had 11 co-conspirators, but she wasn't the leader. Collins pointed to a photograph of a warehouse complex outside town. The operation was run from here. Military-grade communications center, enough jamming equipment to black out electronic communications for the entire county. The smell of fresh coffee couldn't mask the metallic taste of fear in my mouth. What were they planning? Collins hesitated, the way federal agents do when they're about to share classified information with a civilian. We found detailed maps of armored car routes, bank security schedules, emergency response protocols. They were planning a heist? Multiple heists, coordinated robberies across 6 counties, all happening simultaneously while their jammers kept law enforcement blind and deaf. I stared at the photographs, trying to process the scope of what Karen had been part of. How much money are we talking about? Conservative estimate, $47 million. $47 million. Karen had attacked me, threatened my neighbors, and jammed emergency services as practice for a multi-county crime spree that would have funded a small army. "There's something else," Collins continued. "We found your address in Karen's operational files, not as a target for jamming, as a target for elimination." The words seemed to echo in my kitchen. Elimination? Karen documented your radio expertise, your father's emergency service background, your knowledge of communication protocols, Her team identified you as the biggest threat to their operation. So the radio interference complaints were designed to get you to shut down your equipment voluntarily. When that didn't work, they escalated to FCC seizure. When that still left you with emergency communication capability, Collins gestured toward my garage, where Dad's beacon was still blinking its steady signal. They decided to eliminate the threat permanently. I walked to my kitchen window, looked across at Karen's empty house. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the morning breeze like twisted party streamers. Agent Collins, you said Karen wasn't the leader. Who was? Stephen Mitchell, Karen's ex-husband, former Army electronic warfare specialist, discharged under questionable circumstances 3 years ago. He recruited Karen because she had the perfect cover, suburban IT professional with no apparent criminal connections. Where is he now? That's the problem, Mr. Morrison. Stephen Mitchell disappeared the night we arrested Karen. We think he's planning to activate the jamming network manually. The implications hit me like ice water. He's still going to try the heist? Modified plan, smaller target, but still potentially devastating. Collins pointed to a circled location on the map. First National Bank has a weekly armored car pickup every Friday, $42 million in consolidated deposits from smaller branches. Friday. Today was Thursday. Agent Collins, what do you need from me? Stephen Mitchell knows we've compromised most of his jamming sites, but there's one location we haven't found yet, the primary control node that coordinates all the others. You think it's in this neighborhood? We know it is. Our monitoring equipment tracked the command signals during the raid. They originated within a quarter mile of your house. I thought about Karen's confidence, her absolute certainty that she could control the electronic environment around my home, her knowledge of Dad's emergency beacon, her ability to coordinate with tactical teams. It's in her house, I said suddenly. We searched Karen's house, found the jammers in her attic, but no command and control equipment. Not in the house, under it. Collins looked at me sharply. What makes you think that? Karen knew about my father's hardwired emergency beacon, equipment that was installed 20 years ago and never registered with any public utility. The only way she could know about it is if she'd been monitoring underground communication lines. Underground? I led Collins to my basement, showed her the cable runs Dad had installed when he was volunteer fire chief, hardwired connections that bypassed all the normal communication networks, designed to function even during disasters. These cables connect to every emergency services building in the county, fire stations, police stations, hospital, airport. If someone tapped into this network, they could monitor all emergency communications and coordinate jamming attacks with perfect timing. Collins was already on her phone. This is Collins. I need ground-penetrating radar at 847 Pine Street, Priority Alpha. That afternoon, I watched from my front porch as FBI technicians discovered Stephen Mitchell's real base of operations, not Karen's attic, not some distant warehouse. A fully equipped underground bunker beneath Karen's basement, military-grade communication center, computer servers, enough electronic warfare equipment to coordinate criminal operations across multiple states. How long has this been here? I asked Collins as they brought up equipment that looked like it belonged in a Pentagon facility. Construction permits show major electrical work 18 months ago. Karen filed for a wine cellar renovation. City inspector never looked too closely at why a wine cellar needed 3-phase power and fiber optic connections. Stephen Mitchell had spent 18 months building a criminal command center literally underneath my neighborhood. Karen had been his perfect cover, the complaining neighbor who drew all attention to surface-level radio disputes, while her ex-husband constructed an electronic warfare center beneath her house. But here's what they hadn't counted on. Dad's old emergency beacon wasn't just transmitting a distress signal. It was also receiving and logging every electronic signal in the area. For 3 days, while Karen thought she'd silenced me completely, Dad's beacon had been recording every command transmission from Stephen Mitchell's underground bunker. FBI now had 18 hours of intercepted communications, including detailed plans for tomorrow's armored car heist. Mr. Morrison, Collins said, as her team loaded the last of the seized equipment into their trucks. Your father's emergency beacon didn't just help us catch Karen's team, it gave us everything we need to stop Stephen Mitchell. That evening, I sat in my quiet garage and looked at Dad's old fire department badge, still lying on the concrete floor where it had fallen during Karen's first electronic attack. But now I understood why it had fallen, not because of Karen's jamming equipment. Because Dad's spirit knew I was going to need that badge and everything it represented to protect my community from threats he never could have imagined. Tomorrow, Stephen Mitchell would discover what happens when you threaten a neighborhood that's protected by 30 years of emergency service experience, even from beyond the grave. Friday morning arrived with the kind of stillness that makes experienced emergency responders nervous. I was drinking coffee on my front porch when Agent Collins called. Her voice had that tight control that comes from too much caffeine and too little sleep. Mitchell's activated 3 backup jamming sites. We didn't even know they existed. Where? Cell phone towers. He's been hiding equipment on communication infrastructure for months. Every time we shut down one site, 2 more come online. Through my kitchen window, I could see Collins' surveillance van parked across the street. The FBI had turned my neighborhood into a command center, but Stephen Mitchell was still one step ahead. Agent Collins, where exactly is that armored car pickup? First National Downtown Branch, scheduled for 11:47 a.m. She paused. David, Mitchell's jamming network is more sophisticated than we realized. If he activates everything simultaneously, emergency services will be completely blind. For a 15-minute window, more than enough time to hit the armored car and disappear. I set down my coffee cup and made a decision that would have terrified my father and made him proud at the same time. Collins, I need you to get me into Dad's old emergency communication center. What emergency communication center? Fire station number 3. Dad installed a hardwired backup system in 1987, completely independent from all modern networks. If Mitchell jams everything electronic in the county, that old system will still function. An hour later, I stood in the basement of Fire Station 3, staring at equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum. Vacuum tubes, mechanical switches, analog radio transmitters that had been cutting-edge technology when Dad was my age. "This stuff actually works?" asked Mike, the airport electronics technician who'd volunteered to help. Dad tested it every month until the day he died. I flipped the master switch and the basement filled with the warm glow of vacuum tubes coming online. Analog systems don't care about digital jamming. The beauty of Dad's emergency network was its simplicity. No computers to hack, no digital signals to block. Just pure analog radio communication that functioned exactly the same way it had in 1987. At 11:15 a.m., Stephen Mitchell activated every jamming device in his network. Every cell phone in the county went dead. Police radios went silent. Emergency dispatch lost communication with ambulances, fire trucks, and patrol cars. Even the FBI's sophisticated digital communication systems were overwhelmed by the electronic warfare assault. But in the basement of Fire Station 3, Dad's analog radios crackled to life with crystal clear communication. "All units, this is Emergency Backup Command. We have visual contact with armored car, proceeding normally to First National Bank." I was sitting at Dad's old radio desk, coordinating county-wide emergency response, using equipment that was older than most of the FBI agents upstairs. "Backup Command, this is Sheriff Unit 7. We're completely blind here. No radio, no dispatch, no coordination." Unit 7, maintain position at First National. Suspect vehicle is a dark blue panel van, approaching from the east. 2 additional vehicles providing support. Through Dad's network, I could coordinate with every emergency responder in the county. Police units moving into position, FBI tactical teams, even airport security providing aerial surveillance. Stephen Mitchell had spent 18 months building a sophisticated electronic warfare network, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that all emergency communications depended on modern digital systems. He'd never accounted for a stubborn old fire chief who'd insisted on maintaining analog backup systems, just in case. At 11:44 a.m., Stephen Mitchell's team arrived at First National Bank. They found 30 FBI agents, 12 sheriff's deputies, and a tactical response team waiting for them. "Mitchell is in custody," Agent Collins reported over Dad's radio network. "Clean takedown, no shots fired." But as I sat in that basement, coordinating the arrest of a man who'd threatened my community, I realized something that changed everything. This had never been about Stephen Mitchell's criminal enterprise. It had never been about Karen's electronic harassment. It had never been about my confiscated radio equipment. This had been about Dad's legacy. For 30 years, he'd maintained emergency communication systems that nobody appreciated and few people understood. Analog radio networks that seemed obsolete in an age of cell phones and internet connectivity. But when digital technology failed, when sophisticated criminals used military-grade jamming equipment to blind modern emergency services, Dad's old-fashioned analog systems had saved the day. "David," Agent Collins' voice came through the basement radio. "We need you to maintain communication coordination until we can restore digital networks. Could be several hours." I looked around the basement at Dad's carefully maintained equipment. Vacuum tubes glowing warm amber, mechanical switches clicking with precision, analog meters showing signal strength and transmission quality. Everything still worked exactly as Dad had left it. "Copy that, Agent Collins. Emergency Backup Command will maintain coordination until digital systems are restored." For the next 4 hours, I sat at my father's radio desk and did exactly what he'd trained me to do since childhood. I maintained communications. I coordinated emergency response. I made sure that people in crisis could reach the help they needed. Stephen Mitchell had tried to use electronic warfare against my community, but he'd forgotten that the most sophisticated weapon is worthless against someone who understands the fundamentals. Dad's analog radio network had defeated military-grade jamming equipment through the simple principle that sometimes the old ways are the best ways. As afternoon turned to evening and digital communications slowly came back online, I finally understood why Dad's badge had fallen during Karen's first electronic attack. It hadn't fallen because of her jamming equipment. It had fallen because Dad's spirit knew I was going to need his training, his equipment, and his legacy to protect the community he'd spent 30 years serving. That badge was meant to be picked up. By me. Tonight. 3 weeks later, I stood in my garage holding a decision that would change everything. The FCC had returned all my confiscated radio equipment with a formal apology. Agent Collins had recommended me for a civilian service award. The county commissioners wanted to hire me as emergency communications coordinator. But in my hands was something more important than recognition or job offers. Dad's fire department badge, and an application to rejoin the volunteer fire department as their communications officer. The smell of autumn leaves drifted through my open garage door as I weighed my choice. I could rebuild my quiet retirement, restore my radio hobby, and pretend that Karen and Stephen Mitchell had been just a temporary disruption. Or I could accept that Dad's legacy had chosen me for something bigger. My phone buzzed. Text message from Agent Collins. "David, we found something in Mitchell's files you need to see. Can you meet me at the station?" An hour later, Collins spread a file across the table that made my hands shake. "Stephen Mitchell kept detailed surveillance records on you for 18 months. Not just your radio activities, your daily routine, your shopping patterns, even your grief counseling sessions after Martha died. The invasion of privacy was staggering. Mitchell had documented every aspect of my life with military precision. Why such detailed surveillance for one neighbor?" Collins turned the page to reveal something that stopped my heart. "Because you weren't just any neighbor, David. You were the primary threat to their entire operation." The document was titled Subject, David Morrison, Threat Assessment. Below it, a detailed analysis of my technical knowledge, my father's emergency service background, and my potential to disrupt their criminal enterprise. Mitchell identified you as the one person in the county who could maintain emergency communications during a coordinated jamming attack. Everything they did, Karen's harassment, the FCC seizure, even the death threats, was designed to eliminate you before the heist. I stared at my father's badge lying next to Mitchell's threat assessment. 2 pieces of metal that represented completely different worldviews. "Agent Collins, there's something I need to know. Was Dad's emergency communication system really that important, or did we just get lucky?" Collins smiled for the first time since I'd met her. "David, your father's analog backup network is now being studied by Homeland Security as a model for national emergency preparedness. Turns out, a lot of communities are vulnerable to electronic warfare attacks because they rely entirely on digital systems. So Dad was ahead of his time? Your father was a genius who understood that the most sophisticated technology is worthless if it can be defeated by someone with better technology. But simple, reliable systems work forever." That evening, I made my choice. I drove to Fire Station 3 and handed Chief Rodriguez my application to rejoin the volunteer department as communications officer. David, you sure about this? The pay is terrible, the hours are worse, and half the time people don't appreciate what you do. I looked around the station at faces I'd known since childhood, men and women who chose to risk their lives to protect their community, not because it was profitable or glamorous, but because someone had to do it. Chief, my father spent 30 years making sure emergency responders could communicate during disasters. Mitchell proved that electronic warfare is a real threat to public safety. So you want to update Dad's systems? Modernize the whole network? No, sir. I want to expand Dad's systems, build analog backup networks for every emergency service in the state. Make sure that no criminal enterprise can ever blind our emergency responders again. Chief Rodriguez grinned and shook my hand. Welcome back to the department, Morrison. Your father would be proud. But as I drove home that night, I realized something that would have surprised Dad. I wasn't doing this just to honor his legacy. Karen and Stephen Mitchell had targeted me because I represented something they feared, a citizen who understood that freedom and safety require eternal vigilance, someone willing to maintain unglamorous systems that most people never think about until disaster strikes, and those systems are all that stand between order and chaos. They'd made a critical error in their threat assessment. They'd assumed that a man grieving his wife's death would be too broken to fight back. They'd mistaken grief for weakness and quiet retirement for surrender. But Dad had raised me to understand that the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire. Karen had provided the fire, Stephen Mitchell had provided the pressure, and I'd emerged stronger than either of them had calculated. 6 months later, I received a letter from Karen in federal prison. She wanted to apologize, to explain that she'd been manipulated by her ex-husband to ask for my forgiveness. I never answered that letter, not because I couldn't forgive her, but because forgiveness was irrelevant. Karen and Stephen Mitchell had taught me something more valuable than any apology could provide. They'd shown me that in a world where technology grows more complex every day, there's still profound power in understanding the fundamentals. Dad's analog radio networks now protected 12 counties across 3 states. His emergency communication protocols had been adopted by Homeland Security as a national standard. His stubborn insistence on maintaining obsolete backup systems had revolutionized how America approaches electronic warfare threats. And every night, I sat in my restored garage, listening to the quiet chatter of emergency communications, knowing that if disaster struck, my community could still talk to each other. Because some frequencies can never be jammed. Some connections run deeper than technology. And some legacies are worth fighting for, no matter how sophisticated the opposition. The old fire department badge sits on my radio desk now, right next to Dad's original emergency transmitter, still active, still broadcasting. Still reminding me that the most important battles are fought not with the newest weapons, but with the oldest virtues. Duty, service, the simple determination to answer when someone calls for help. Karen learned that lesson too late. But she learned it